Hello, everyone. I just wanted to make a quick supplementary video. Um, Probably not really necessary, but there's already videos on Bruckner and Fisher. Why is death bad? But I wanted to just say a couple of things to reinforce. Perhaps I haven't looked at those videos in a while, but just a couple of things to reinforce some central ideas in that essay. There are two terms which are kind of technical, I guess, but they're good terms that are essential to what's going on in that essay. And those are prenatal non-existence and posthumous non-existence. These terms are necessary in order to get a handle on what they're calling the asymmetry problem. I like to think of it this way. Could think of anyone's life as consisting of a line. And everything on that line, it means that you or the person is alive. And as we're living our lives, it continues. We have a past and a future, and we're always at that moment, that strange moment between the two called the present that we don't really understand. But what's interesting about, I think, characterizing life this way, or a life this way, is that while we're alive, we're on that line, and death is always in the future. If one takes a basic Epicurean view of it, and even not an Epicurean view of it, death is always in the future. But once a life is complete, it's a line segment rather than a ray, right? And we can think of everything on that line as being a person's life, part of their experience. Now, there is a before and after, right? That is, the world existed before we did. And before we existed, we did not exist. Before we were born, we did not exist. So let's call that our prenatal. I'm just going to, just so I can fit it all. A prenatal non-existence. That just means the time before we were born. And that is bookended by, so I can get room, our posthumous non-existence. Okay. Under this view, a person lives for a finite period of time. They are born and then they die. And the period before they were born, they didn't exist. So we call it our prenatal or before birth non-existence. And after they die, they don't exist. So let's call that our posthumous or after death non-existence. The asymmetry problem is something that really comes from Lucretius, who was a follower of Epicurus rather than Epicurus himself, my understanding. And the problem is that we treat these two periods of non-existence asymmetrically, which just means that we treat them differently. We give them different values. Why is it a problem? Well, it's a problem only if you believe that it's irrational and inconsistent to treat them asymmetrically, to treat them differently. And here's the argument from the Epicurean side. Things that are the same should be treated the same. That is, unless there's a relevant difference between two different things, you treat them the same. And the question is there a relevant difference between prenatal and posthumous non-existence? The Epicurean would say no, non-existence is non-existence. It has no value for us, it's not part of our experience, etc. So if non-existence is always just non-existence, we should treat them the same. We should treat them asymmetrically. We shouldn't give them different values. But the idea is that we tend, because of our nature, because of our fears, because of our inconsistencies, to treat them differently, and that is inconsistent and therefore irrational. For instance, if I had 2 cups of water in front of me uh, that were exactly the same amount of water, the same temperature, the same purity, in exactly the same type of cup, then it would be irrational for me to prefer one to the other, or to say that one is good and the other is bad. The idea is that whatever I say about the one, I should be willing to say about the other. Well, the same is true of the non-existence here. Problem is that we as human beings really, really care and consider a bad thing our posthumous non-existence, and really, really don't care and don't consider either a good or bad thing our prenatal non-existence. That is, we're indifferent to the fact that we didn't exist before we were born, but we're not indifferent to the fact that we won't exist after we die. So from the Epicurean point of view, it's completely irrational to consider death, that is posthumous non-existence, a bad thing, and not consider prenatal non-existence a bad thing. That is, if we're going to consider one a bad thing, we should consider the other bad thing. Or if we're going to consider one to be a neutral thing, we should consider the other to be a neutral thing. So that's the basic problem. It's a problem because, well, from the Epicurean point of view, it's irrational. It's irrational to do this. There's no basis for it. What Bruckner and Fisher are trying to do is to solve the asymmetry problem. And what would that mean? To solve the asymmetry problem would mean to, from their point of view, to establish that it is not irrational to regard these 2 periods of non-existence differently. That is, to treat them asymmetrically. And they do this by trying to establish that there is a relevant difference between the 2 periods of non-existence, between posthumous and prenatal non-existence. Now, you have to read the essay to see what their solution is to the asymmetry problem, and I hope that I've said some things in the essay, in the videos, to help you with that. But the basic idea is that to solve the asymmetry problem would be to establish that it is not irrational, it is not inconsistent to regard these 2 periods of non-existence differently, to give them different values. To solve the asymmetry problem, therefore, would necessitate you establishing that there is a relevant difference. And they give an argument for that. It has to do with, what they, the whole essay is really about time, right? And about how the same thing can have very different values for us, depending on whether it's in the past or the future, right? That's what you have to look at. So I just want to put that out there. I just want to make sure that we all have kind of the, the vocabulary necessary to really read and understand and evaluate this article, which is a very good article. I think really opens things up and adds a new dimension.